Hello everybody and welcome to the show. I'm here today with Joshua Denny, and in this lockdown time we thought we'd do a bit of Gurdjieff and isolation. And I'm going to start with reading from page 565 of All and Everything. Just do a couple of, sorry they are long paragraphs, but I'll do them, and then we're going to discuss abnormalities and isolation. So this is from page 565, it's the last paragraph. And the second fact, the fact ensuing from the abnormal conditions of the being existence of your favourites, is that when, from the very beginning of the arising of their offspring, they intentionally try by every kind of means for the purpose of making them respond to these abnormal conditions round them, to fix in their logic Nestorian localizations as many impressions as possible obtained exclusively only from such artificial perceptions as are again due to the results of their abnormal existence, which maleficent action of theirs towards their offspring they call education. Then the totality of all such artificial perceptions gradually segregates itself in their common presences and acquires its own independent functioning, connected only as much with the functioning of their planetary body as is necessary merely for its automatic manifestation, and the totality of these artificial perceptions is then perceived by them, owing to their naivety, as their real consciousness. But as for the sacred data for genuine being consciousness put into them by great nature, which consciousness ought to be possessed by them from the very beginning of their preparation for responsible existence together with the properties inherent in them, which engender in them the genuine sacred being impulses of faith, hope, love, and conscience. These data, becoming gradually also isolated and being left to themselves, evolve independently of the intentions of the responsible beings, and also, of course, also independently of the bearers of them themselves, and come to be regarded as what is called the subconsciousness. So they're talking about love, hope, and faith, hope, and love, and connecting it with conscience. And I was trying to talk to people in this time of isolation of this is a great time to perhaps open our conscience or awaken our conscience. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, well, it's a another great passage that it can be hard to follow, because he uses all his usual kind of strange words and language. But yeah, I mean, the basic idea, isn't it, that we have these three brains then, or three centers, whatever you want to call it, three modes of being and perception, and that instead of their kind of natural sort of course of development that would be desired, there kind of arises a phony education. So there's all this like data gets put into these brains or centers from outside, and kind of because of the way it's sort of put into us, and also just like the general conditions of the culture, that we're situated in, that it kind of just comes to have to act automatically. So it's like, we down, I suppose an analogy nowadays would be like with computers and stuff. So, we've got a computer, and these kind of like programs or software then is like downloaded into us from outside. And these programs just run independently. They're constantly running in our system and, determining the way we see the world, what we think, how we feel. And because of that kind of automatic functioning, it doesn't really give us any scope for, we could say, real learning, something like some kind of learning that we've come to ourselves rather than just like some data that's been put into us from outside. So yeah, it doesn't really give us a chance for learning something of our own or like real sort of independent action. We just constantly, the programs kind of determine what we see and experience in the world and how we see it, and how we can respond to that. So it's like they don't allow for much kind of independent action. And in terms of the work, like Gurdjieff's other writings about the work, the teaching, I think he kind of refers to that same sort of thing, what he's talking about here, these like automatically acting data. I think in the other terminology that he used earlier, I think he'd refer to it as the formatory apparatus. So again, like the idea that it's like the word apparatus is like a mechanism, isn't it? So he kind of describes the formatory apparatus as, again, like this kind of function that we have that's natural to us, that's kind of needed. So like we have this in Beelzebub's upstairs, we have this function that can receive these impressions and kind of, process them. But he says that it's kind of not, it's come not to perform the role that was intended for it. So like in terms of the formatory apparatus, he kind of says, well, yes, it is kind of what it says. It's a mechanism, an apparatus for forming things, putting things together, making connections, associations, seeing samenesses, and like recording experiences in a way that we can remember them effectively. So I can, if I'm in a certain situation that has a similarity to one of my past, then this kind of formatory apparatus will enable me to make that connection. Like, oh, I kind of know what this situation's about. I've experienced it before.
I suppose with what's going on at the moment, how we've led to this situation now, with this worldwide pandemic and everything, is because people aren't using all their, they're just using their formatory apparatus and not developing themselves, or, as Gurdjieff was trying to make us a harmonious person.
Yeah. So like we're saying, this formatory apparatus, then it's came to function, as I say, not as it should then, and kind of like in the same way he talks about in Beelzebub, like semi-independently, of us. So when he introduces the term formatory apparatus, he kind of does it in contrast to what he calls the centers, or we could say the brains. And like he kind of distinguishes between the centers and like the formatory apparatus in terms of like, well, says the centers are kind of like organic or living, you could say conscious, whereas this apparatus is not organic or living, but just an apparatus. I mean, he kind of says, well, in a deeper level, everything is living, but it's just, again, he's just making a kind of differentiation of like, gradations relatively. That apparatus is just like, it's just an apparatus. It's a tool. It's of a more mechanical level than our actual, like say centers or brains, but it's kind of a tool that we need, that's been given to us to interact with them, with the world, with life. We need it as a mechanism to make these connections, to be able to function, have some degree of basic common sense, So it's like we need it for that. But that if it just operates in the way it is now, it's not really going to serve us to develop our like, true nature, these true centers or brains that are in us,
It's one of the things that's quite missing in people. Sorry to say, the majority of people, not many of them, have common sense. As my friend once said to me, common sense isn't that common. Gurdjieff was trying to get people to think using their common sense, but real common sense, I suppose, is a mixture of the three, of thinking when we need to think, feeling when we need to feel, being aware of what's actually happening.
Yeah, so exactly. So this like formatory apparatus, though, like, so we use it to acquire data from outside, so from the outside world. So like just literally what we experience in the natural environment, and also, people. So, it provides us with a means to a certain, kind of information. But like we're saying, that information by itself, though it has like a realm of utility, like we're saying, there is an application, realm of application of this data, the formatory apparatus, or it has a function. But just in itself, that's not going to really provide what we need. And so like that kind of consists of the formatory apparatus and like automatic patterns, that have been established from the past. So they may have, like in certain situations, they may have a utility, this data that we've, things that we've been taught, obviously from our parents or whatever. They can have situations where they're, that knowledge is valuable and is needed, But it's just saying that obviously there are situations in life that have a uniqueness and are not kind of, similar to previous situations. So if we're just inheriting like knowledge from the past, then yes, it might be inadequate to deal with new situations that develop and arise. So like this is like a basic unit of intelligence that we've been given, like a little computer, and it can be programmed to an extent that it can deal with similar, fairly simple situations that do repeat. But in terms of any more like any situations that require, I don't know, more intelligence, or there's something going on there that's not kind of average, something that's a bit unexpected or a bit rare in the course of life, then it's not going to have the data to deal with that. So it's like it's just a basic form of intelligence, but not the more kind of real form of intelligence that, again, he would associate with our, our three brains or our centers, which has this like, it's not based upon the past. It's not limited to like data that it's acquired in the past in order to see things or see connections or act. It can like learn in the moment. So like obviously a lot of the time when humans are responding to crises that develop, we're using this formatory apparatus. And the nature of the crisis is that it develops really fast, in terms of time. Crisis is very fast, like this virus, they're always kind of lagging behind, aren't they, in terms of being able to see what effect their actions are having. It's like we do something now, but we're not going to actually be able to tell till, I don't know, a few weeks down the road. We're not going to really be able to see whether that's had a positive effect. Of course, we take the actions based on the previous knowledge that we have. And so we're pretty confident that if we do this, it'll have a certain effect. But of course, we don't know that till we get there. So that kind of, again, this normal form of intelligence then that we use is limited to time in that way. It can't really keep up with like the speed of a crisis, or like, significant hazards.
Because we're living in the now, aren't we? We're living in this moment, so we don't know what. Like, I know what you're saying about we don't know what's going to be the outcome of what's happening now. But Gurdjieff was saying that calamities, and this is a kind of a calamity, isn't it, that we're going through, is something that does help people either wake up or to start developing how they think, feel, or act. So this is some ways of time to start developing on yourself, or if you're into that kind of work, this is a great thing to work on with yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm like, yeah, like you're saying, it's a big thread, isn't it, kind of in his work and all those ideas that like, times of crisis and hazard, have a value in them. Of course they can bring, bad things potentially, or maybe even automatically, but it's like saying balanced with that, the bad stuff that the obvious bad stuff that they can bring, they have a potential, there's also a potential there for something maybe new to be learned, because like the nature of a crisis is kind of like, it's an interruption, isn't it? It's in the kind of normal flow, the status quo. It's an interruption to that. So that interruption in terms of the work is like a shock. And so there's a potential there for something new or something different, that's not just in accordance with the status quo, something new to happen. So they do like this, lots of people, have the idea that, oh, well, let's hope that through this kind of crisis, maybe something will change, for the better in like society and the social structures. So it's kind of, implied that crisis is maybe not always, or maybe always, the means of change. Of course, it could have bad change or good change, but maybe it's always the means of change. It's like what appears to us as crisis, or something really significantly unexpected. And like
sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, it's just like, I was going to say, he mentions, doesn't he, like in Beelzebub's Tales, that nature has to create kind of what he calls unexpectednesses in the life of the individual man, because he kind of can't perform his duty, like say what's required of him, without these like external unexpectednesses. They're like needed in order to induce, you could say, like certain states in him, certain experiences which are needed to, like, the energy of them is needed to feed the cosmos then,
Because I suppose also, like what you were saying of the outcome of this, we don't know how it's going to outcome, and it's what sort of people are going to be the leaders to show people how to be, and many people keep going on about, oh, when this is back to normal. Well, I myself don't think it will ever be normal again. And I wonder if this is the kind of thing where Gurdjieff was preparing people for, to say that, there's going to be a big change. We need the right kind of people to lead, or maybe not necessarily lead, but to be examples to other people of how we can get through this, rather than, oh, we need to go back to the monetary system and back to every man for himself, where instead we need to work together as a society. And I think Gurdjieff was saying if he could teach so many people, then they would go ahead and teach other people, a bit like the virus. One person gets it, passes it to 2, who passes it to 5, but instead this is a good virus, with the Gurdjieff work, or any kind of work like that, where they're trying to perhaps bring a more harmonious way of living for everybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, like you said, the idea is the hope that these different, teachings or systems, of spiritual development, the idea is, that you'd hope that they would make people, produce people then who are more capable to respond to, like what we're saying, these uncertain conditions. So like, again, the idea that we need to be able to establish or make contact, he kind of suggests that it's already there, this kind of higher intelligence that can deal, you know, with things in the moment. It's not limited to like pre-acquired knowledge. You know, it kind of says that that's there, but we need to make contact with that. So again, the idea that the work and these teachings hopefully can enable individual people to have a contact with this sort of, you know, higher intelligence then, and then through their actions, then yes, they can maybe just even working with, like I say, maybe even just working with a tiny group of people, or, you know, doesn't have to be necessarily a big organization, but just through the influence that they can have on a small number of people, that can, like you say, over time can spread out and have an effect. But yes, just definitely the idea that particularly that people who have some kind of developed, you know, contact with a higher intelligence, that they're needed, you know, they're very much needed in these times of crisis, even though we might not see their influence overtly. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, I do know what you mean. Kind of sitting there, I was just thinking about, you know, where are these people? But maybe they aren't ones that we need to be, you know, the superstars that everybody looks up to. Everybody's too busy looking at pop stars or sports stars. And this has got to change, isn't it? Hopefully people will start seeing, no, we need to work together, and it's not about being the greatest or being the best.
Yeah. But like you say, you know, maybe some of those people just, you know, they don't come into the limelight, but they have an effect, enough of effect on enough of, you know, a large enough number of people to, you know, make some kind of difference, even though it's not obvious that they're, you know, we don't know who these people that maybe are, but they just, you know, they get things done just through having, you know, even an unknown influence, you know. But it's enough. The idea is that these people are needed, and that it's only kind of through their, you know, work that these crises can, like, you know, really be you know, resolved, or that we can actually make some real progress, you know, in society. Yeah.
Because Gurdjieff came, I know he's given us all a great big book to read, to learn from, and it's a very difficult book to read, and that's why we have little groups to work on it together, but the answers are in there. But for people that are during this lockdown suddenly going, I know there's more to life, you know, and they might not have the words of putting it, of the finding your, getting in touch with your higher self to develop yourself. It's people like that that I'm hoping that the Gurdjieff work or some kind of work will come to, or maybe through these shows will perhaps give them hope that there is something to go towards.
Yeah, well, it's like, again, like in the work, again, there's this idea that these crises, these shocks, then again, they bring a potential, an opportunity, but how that's, you know, how that manifests depends on how, if, you know, how the individual person takes that opportunity, you know, how they react to those conditions, you know. Like you say, maybe a person in these times, they're forced into, you know, isolation or lockdown, so they're, you know, they're more kind of limited than they would be normally. So maybe there is more time possibly there for them to ponder on things, or, you know, maybe see, you know, come to some insights about what's really important in life, or what they you know, maybe what they really want to do with their life, or things like that. So that, you know, that these times can provide those opportunities. But of course, there's, as we know, there's the negative potential there, that people can just, those limitations can just manifest in a negative way, that people can maybe just get pissed off and just be like fighting, you know, maybe with their family, or, you know, so
With
there's
themselves.
well, yeah. So I'm just saying, it can, like, you know, those conditions can naturally have, because of the nature of them, they naturally have those two kind of potentials, you know. It has to have the potential of, like, being able to manifest in a negative way and a positive way, in order for it to be a real opportunity, you know, a real potential for change. You know, it can't just be mechanical, that just give us these conditions and we will respond, you know, in a set way, because that's just, yeah, it's not really involving our own, you say, will or kind of choice, you know, which is, again, in the work, that's expressed as something of, well, maybe the essence of the work, to be able to, like, make a real choice, you know.
Because we're lucky we've got the internet, and people, if they are searching for something, hopefully would come across something like this show or other shows that do things like this. You know, thankfully we have the internet now for people to look for whatever they want. But
Yeah.
back in Gurdjieff's time, obviously he had his own calamities going on in his life, with the Russian Revolution, and that obviously threw him out of the country he was living in, which was Armenia at the time, and so he had to travel across the Caucasus Mountains and go on
Yeah.
these intrepid adventures, but at the same time was something that helped him and the people he was with to
Yeah.
work on themselves.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, like in terms of his his life story, doesn't he? He seems to, at least how he makes it out, you know, in his autobiography, you know, how he writes about his life. You know, he makes it out as if, you know, he was Mr. Hazard. You know, it was just like either seeking it out deliberately, like, you know, conflict zones, or I don't know, you know, intense situations, or maybe it just followed him around. But it certainly, you know, he supposedly got shot 3 times. You know, so he suggests that he has had a more kind of hazardous life than most people, and maybe even courted that because, you know, maybe there was something in him that kind of even naturally, you know, just felt that there was you know, a potential in those kind of circumstances in intense situations. Then, you know, like he talks about seeking out battlefields and war zones, you know, to, you know, to try to well, because obviously he had his question about what is the purpose of, you know, life on earth, and particularly man's life. So in order to, you know, study that question, he needs to study man in kind of his most intense, you know, forms of expression, like being war and, you know, these other things. So yeah, again, the idea that if you can make use of it, a greater, you know, situation of hazard or risk, there's greater potential there. You know, the greater the risk, maybe, the greater the potential that's there.
It's kind of like facing that fear, isn't it? Or, you know, almost death situations where your own life could be wiped out at any moment is something. Well, he says it's the kind of time where you actually wake up properly for that moment, and hopefully you can grasp that moment and you survive. But instead of carrying on with your life normally in your, you know, the normal way, you start looking at things in a more open way of what else is there. Because I know I've just said the word normal way, but really the way we live our lives isn't normal, is it? He says we live in a lunatic asylum, which we do. Everything's very illogical, and you know, we don't live harmoniously together. Surely we can all live as a people on this planet in a much better way, and at one with nature, and you know, not having this materialistic, well, too materialistic a view of life.
Yeah, well, like again, isn't it in sort of Beelzebub's tales at the end of that, doesn't he? Sort of Beelzebub is like, you know, speaking with the, you know, God or the absolute, or, you know, and, you know, he's kind of asking Beelzebub, what you know, what can we do, you know, for man's situation? And he kind of suggests, isn't it, that one of the only ways is going to be by like man's kind of remembrance of death, or at least not just for himself, but in terms of his, you know, his neighbor, you know, being able to really realize that this other guy is going to die, and trying to feel into that, you know, and have some kind of compassion for that. And that's, yeah, he kind of suggests that realization, that remembrance of death, maybe the only thing that can kind of save us, or like you're saying, provide enough of a kind of, you know, shock or like input of energy that can kind of like, you know, open our eyes and make us see something, even just for a moment. But whatever is seen in that, even that flash, might be enough to have a, you know, change the course of our lives, you know, be a determining influence in how our life goes, you know, in the future. So of course, like in times of crisis, people can have intense experiences and like maybe contemplate, you know, death, you know, more than they would normally. It's made more apparent to them, so that the shock of death can, you know, maybe like be sobering to their mind, so it might help them. But also there's that idea, isn't there, that times of like crisis, common crisis, you know, like where we're all in it together, it's something that threatens us all, not just some people in society, you know, so it's a common threat. Times of a common threat, it's known, isn't it, that people kind of pull together, like take the example in the war and the Blitz and things like that. People were, you know, it's reported that you know, people were able to help each other so much and get on so much better and focus their, you know, work so much more effectively because there was a common threat, you know. So that threat served to like help people come together for a time and work together in a way that they're not normally able to do, you know. And so that the crisis, you know, kind of causes people to act in a more sort of harmonious way, at least for a time, and that kind of enables the crisis to be solved. But it also maybe enables people to have experiences during that time that, you know, change the course of their life, even though we might not see it, you know, because the idea is that a crisis comes, okay, we kind of sort it out, but then everything just returns to normal. That's the idea, isn't it? That's what, like you're saying, the fear that we're just going to return, things are just going to go back to the way they were, let's say, possibly. So we might not see overtly that anything's been changed by that, but yet in terms of the actual people, individual people, those experiences might radically change their lives, you know.
Yeah, I've definitely
We
seen
might
some
we
really
might we might not
spirit.
see
Oh,
yeah
sorry, go on.
we might not see that change for generations, you know. Maybe it just changes somebody in the way he is, and then that changes how he is with his kids, and you know, that can have generational influences, you know.
Yeah, because that's what was in the reading at the beginning, was um, how your peers and your education from your family and your school life, or how it molds you. Where,
Yeah,
you know, we can see that the way people are turning out, it's maybe not as good as we think it should be. You know,
yeah,
there is a better way of educating.
yeah. I mean, totally. Like, he kind of suggests that, yeah, we need to revolutionize, radically change our education system, like how we educate, you know, our children and what we educate them. You know, the kind of the whole operating gestalt in our education system. But there's also the idea that anything that's kind of learnt through what we would call education, in terms of, like, you know, being just directly given to us from outside, that's kind of at this level of just information. So that anything that's given to us that way only has a limited application, a limited realm of use, and that what is really needed is, like, what he calls then real understanding, or access to a higher form of intelligence. So it's like saying any form of education is going to have limitations in terms of, like, and producing or enabling people to connect with a real intelligence. But of course, there can be better and worse forms of education. But he does kind of suggest that any form of education is going to be limited. You know, that it's going to be down to something in the individual themselves that can possibly transform that what is imparted into them, their education, into, like, wisdom. You know.
Because it's experience as well, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things I got from the Gurdjieff work, is that people don't discuss experience enough, and sometimes experience is more important than learning who won the war in whatever, because how people are experiencing their life shows how they're dealing with their life or what's going on in their world.
Yeah, totally. Like you're saying, yeah. The form, a lot of the form of the education and what is seen as valuable to learn, you know, can be at odds with what we really what maybe we as man at this moment in time, what we need, you know, to it's what we really need in terms of to be able to fulfill our true potential, like what we're being educated in terms of just facts and dates and things like that. It's just, it's not really much use to us, is it, when we, you know. But it's like the power of the power of, like, this formatory apparatus is like, it's like somehow you could say, well, the apparatus or even the ideas have some almost like independence of their own. You know, this idea of memes in terms of, like, the not like now on, like, Facebook meme, but, you know, like like this kind of scientific sense of it, of the, like, almost equivalent of a gene, but in terms of meaning, like ideas. So, like, memes, the idea being that through memes, with, like, a biological, you know, entity, that's how, like, ideas are passed from, you know, people to people, like, almost biologically, not consciously, intentionally passed. So it's like these ideas have an independence of their own, you know, almost a will of their own. So it's like these ideas perpetuate themselves through people, you know. So like it's like almost saying that, you know, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, that's like that date wants to be remembered in people's minds. So that's why that's a fact that kind of constantly, you know, is repeated in us, you know. So there is this idea in the work that he doesn't talk about in those kind of terms. He talks about higher levels and higher beings, and that they have, well, obviously they have their own degree of independence. They have some of their own sort of choice. They're not complete, even though the higher beings are not completely sort of, you know, controlled from above, or they don't just completely follow, like, orders. They have to exercise their own intelligence, you know, and hence his idea that they could be fallible, you know, the higher beings. And so, you know, it's not all just roses in the higher worlds, you know. There can be problems and issues of it, you know. So the idea that the ideas then, like being an analogy here for, like, higher beings, have some will of their own, and that we are to an extent subject to these ideas, this information. And like you say, it becomes automatically acting in us, like a program that just plays itself out, or we're just, like, you know, hosts for this data or its action, you know, its repetition, the same facts, just being repeated through generation to generation, you know.
I think people feel safe and secure knowing that everything's the same over and over, and that's why they like to you know, I have nothing wrong with history. I enjoy history myself, and I suppose I'm meaning, like, if we studied history, it's nice to know about 1066, but we need to know the wheres and whys and why that happened, not just that, William came over and conquered the world and shot Harold in the eye. But with what you're saying about memes and things, I suppose that's kind of like saying we need to have right thinking and right thoughts going on so that they get passed on, rather than, is that the
Yeah,
kind
well,
of thing you mean?
yeah, well, I suppose if I don't know, information then kind of has some sort of, I don't know, independent being of its own, it has almost like a will to some degree of its own, then that information, manifests through people, let's say, or even through a tree, an animal, that you could say they're all forms through which information is. In science, the idea is that forms contain information, like a tree, whatever, stone, that in one sense it's a container for vessel for, or a means for information, So if the idea is, that man, if the information that's, that man experiences or that's relevant to man has this kind of independence, then yeah, it's going to take like some of his own intentional volition to be able to, have some actual conscious influence on this information that's present in him, and it is acting through him and determining his kind of, outlook, his thinking on things. It's like this formatory apparatus, it says that that's kind of what does our thinking for us, 99% of the time. And again, there's not necessarily a problem in that if I'm able to know that, distinguish between sort of automatic formatory thinking and information and maybe like real thinking, So it's not that it's the formatory apparatus is bad and needs to be removed. It's just how it's come to, how it's come to function in this, or how we've come to use it or not use it,
Not use it. Yeah, most people don't use it. Because Gurdjieff describes us all as automatons, which is another word for kind of like robotic or mechanical, which is what we're getting at here in this dialogue. Is about, that's what the problem is that people are too mechanical in their ways and too used to things being as they are. And I think that's what Gurdjieff used to try and point out to people, that we want to be safe and secure, but life isn't like that. Life is unpredictable. Life can be chaotic, and that's why we must always be prepared for the unexpected.
Yeah, I mean, like this, like again, like we were saying, you could see in his life, he kind of seemed to either like seek extreme situations and challenges, or like try to be very sensitive to them, like aware of, kind of challenges or as opportunities, like, to make use of in his life, risks and hazards, like, him realizing that that's a needed means for our transformation. So, it's like the idea that we need these, unexpectednesses and shocks, things that come to us through our life. Like the life provides something that we need to be able to learn and develop intelligence. So it's not the case that we can kind of, or that we need to kind of control our life, kind of determine it in all of its aspects, because we need to receive something from it. Like, again, something that can't be kind of calculated ahead, something unexpected, like the vitality, the hazard, the uncertainty of life. We need that as a kind of, of a food in order to develop like real intelligence. So yeah, that we can't, avoid hazards and crises. We need to kind of court them, go the opposite way, go towards what we might have, inbuilt fears, and resistances towards, again, his idea of doing what it doesn't like. So to an extent, trying to go against your inbuilt programs, your preferences that may or may not be related to your real, what he would call your essence, your real nature. Your preferences, you might think that that's like who I really am, and these are from my real nature, but they could just be at this level of the programs, that the information that we've, learned or came into us and kind of come to act independently and determine our, who we are.
Well, one of the things he talks about is our programming, like what you was just saying. And he's trying to get us to look at our programming. I know that many people call it self-remembering or being self-aware, because if we can look at our programming and see how we just automatically react, and can perhaps change that so that we become aware of what we're doing, whether it's in a negative situation. For example, an argument, you're having an argument with someone, we normally just come back with what we're used to saying, or we're programmed to react in a certain way. And so that's what he's trying to get us to look at, so that we can act differently in this world, or become a different person. Well, not a different person, a real person.
Yeah, try to realize our, real individuality or our true kind of potential, isn't it? I mean, like I say, we need the level of the kind of artificial in us, the level of these mechanisms and stuff to, they have a practical use to engage with the world. But we also, need to find a means to be able to, differentiate between what is like at the level of information or just mechanism in us that we've acquired and what is really, something that's more at a deeper level or more truly, our own, the real seed in this that can be developed. How can we differentiate between that and what's just been downloaded into us, from our environment? How can we differentiate between that? And then how can we kind of use the artificial stuff to develop the authentic?
For some people, that's quite difficult though, because they want to be part of, sorry to say it, but the herd mentality, and they don't want to be different, do they? As Colin Wilson would call people like myself an outsider, because I'm trying not to be like in the herd mentality. I want to be myself.
Yeah, well, like in terms of this, like formatory apparatus, it's like Gurdjieff says that there's kind of like laws, let's say, in the way that it works, this formatory apparatus, then our general mechanism for dealing with the world. And if we kind of can, through self-observation, self-remembering, if we can see something or understand something of the basic kind of laws in that, or just like how it operates, then we can come to use it, more productively, or at least differentiate between when that's kind of dominating our thinking and experience, and to recognize that, okay, then this is just something that's kind of that's been acquired in me. It's just data. It's just like an acquired way of looking at things, being able to recognize when that's present in me and inquire into that.
I think he would like to think that if we are all here in our lockdown, that we are trying to look at ourselves and work on ourselves. And one thing I know, he was a very big animal lover, though I know he was not a vegetarian. I myself am not a vegetarian, but he still believed we should treat animals very well. And of course, many people are saying this virus is from the bats or whatever, these animal food markets or whatever. And I'm pretty sure I'd like to think he would be quite anti them. Do you have anything to say on what he might think on that, or what you get from the Gurdjieff work?
Well, I definitely think that the idea of those those markets in China and stuff, the conditions that they keep the animals, obviously I think that would be against his ideas in terms of the presence of conscience in us. If this conscience that's in us can be active, then it kind of says that a lot of things would, you could say, would disappear in terms of what we do, our attitudes, one of them being our attitude towards animals. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody would become vegan, or vegetarian, but just that how we treat the animals would change our attitude towards them. So we wouldn't keep them in like, the kind of inhumane conditions that we do, and that so we wouldn't treat them that way externally, but that would also change our kind of inner attitude towards animals as as another form of life, and our kind of fellowship with them in terms of being part of the same one life, all different forms of the same life. But like, again, this formatory apparatus, it tends to make us, one way of talking about how it operates is to say that it splits everything into like a dualism, a state of kind of two things that are opposite or contradictory or either or in nature. So it always seems to reduce any situation to like a black and white situation, and Gurdjieff talks about that in saying that we're third force blind. We can't really see this third force that's present in situations. We're always just stuck to seeing it and like thinking about things in terms of the two. So again, like the idea with a crisis, we normally kind of see it as, well, let's say bad, or maybe we see it as good if there's something in it that we see that we can gain in it. So we kind of just reduce things to those kind of two simple terms. And like, I suppose in Beelzebub and his general teaching, he kind of tries to get to communicate something of that by talking of the kind of sometimes the dubious nature of the higher beings, like say that they can act in ways that sometimes seem like to us good or moral or immoral, so he kind of presents this idea that the higher, or maybe the more real or authentic will kind of appear to us as like morally ambiguous, you know, or like we might be shocked by like, you know, the way that the higher laws or beings operate, you know, like let's say that, you know, he does kind of say that a certain number of deaths are needed, like all the time, or at different periods in time, a certain number of deaths are needed, you know, in order to, in the, you know, human deaths or deaths of different forms of life, that there's always a certain number of deaths needed, and maybe that changes through time depending on the circumstances, but that's needed, and like, you know, nature, whatever, or the cosmos feeds off that. So like that can present like a, you know, a contradiction to us, because we can think, oh, you know, that surely the higher powers and the way things should be all peaceful, and what we consider to be peaceful. There shouldn't be like any suffering or unpleasantnesses involved, you know.
It's not quite like that, is it?
Well, that's what he's saying. Like he's saying, like, let's look at the virus then. Like, of course, that involved, the presence of the virus involves like the real suffering and deaths of, you know, a large number of people. And yet, on the flip side, maybe it's needed and is provided, you know, on the other side end of the stick, is providing something that's necessary, or that just maybe things have to happen that way, you know. So that can be a bit shocking. That could be a bit shocking to us to think that maybe the higher powers, then, or like God, the way that the reality operates might not be what we consider to be moral. And then how do we reconcile with that, you know? Like Gurdjieff talks about the idea of man finding out about his real purpose and topping himself, you know, because the idea being that if man really found out why he'd been created, he wouldn't be able to handle it, because he would see it as like being born into slavery, you know, and his kind of ego or mind wouldn't be able to handle that, and that he would have, you know, rebel against it, you know. So the idea that they had to keep man's purpose secret to him. Or if you look at like Beelzebub, you know, he has his multiple trips down to Earth, and in one of them he's got the task of like making people stop animal sacrifice, or at least reduce it. And so he's like thinking about how can he do that, and he ends up having to kind of make change happen through a white lie, you know. Just he kind of tells aids the belief to come about in people that animals are like, you know, watching humans, and they're going to report directly to God on what they're doing, you know. So if you beat an animal, he's going to tell God you're going to be in for it, you know what I mean? So the idea is that they have to use like white lies, you know what I mean, means that we would consider to be a bit, you know, morally questionable, you know. So
well, that is a lovely, one of my favourite bits in the book is that, actually, about when everyone's being really careful of when they're taking their donkey for a walk and making sure their donkey's being treated well, so he doesn't report to God, you know. But then they're doing it out of a duty then, and in a way that's, you know, that's why we've got free will, isn't it, to do what we want. But obviously we've had to be, in Beelzebub's tales, be kind of given a hint as to what we should be doing, even though we're still being given our free will.
Well, yeah, the idea is that it's almost like we can't, maybe at least not now, or maybe for a long time, see things the way they actually are. And so because we can't see them the way they are, we have to be made to act in the right way, or the needed way, through some form of like deception, you know, or at least some form of lie, you know. And I think that's present in Gurdjieff's work. Like, again, he's considered as to be some sort of, you know, a bit controversial master then, or, you know, spiritual teacher in his life. So his very life is kind of like an expression of that unknown nature of the higher forces. Are they good? Are they like in favor of me? You know, they don't really correspond to our like dualistic thinking in terms of good and bad. You know, there's something more to it, obviously, to reality.
To reality. Sorry, I talked over you then. I was going to, because it's kind of like what you were saying earlier. Everyone thinks that you know, when the higher self comes down, or maybe the Messiah turns up, everything's going to be great and good and peaceful. But in some ways, we need these shocks to make us realise what we were doing wrong, or how we are living wrongly. You know, and that's why sometimes I think that maybe that's what this virus is. It's here to show us that we're treating nature badly. You know, and they're not just the virus. They had that Tiger King on Netflix, which I know opened a lot of people up to how animals are kept and looked after. And so that's coming in from another angle. And then there was lots of memes on Facebook and other social medias that where people are in isolation or in lockdown, wildlife's coming out from nature and walking the streets. You know, we've got the goats in playing Dissel, running around the villages, and bobcats walking around streets in America and bears
Yeah.
coming out to look for people in Russia, you know, all over the world. The animals are intrigued as to what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's it. Like you said, again, you see this idea of like what he says, two ends to every stick. Like every phenomena or idea can have, you could say, like a positive side or a negative side, or can be viewed in that way. You know, everything can be put to different uses, you know. And yeah, like you say, so people dying because of the virus, nature thriving, you know, a suffering to some people or a limitation to some is an enablement to another in another area, you know. So there's this mutual, it's like there's always this presence of like what you could, again, dualistically term good and evil. There's always these two kind of, you know, processes or relative, you know, gain and loss between people or between different forms of life or different worlds. It's like, you know, the idea of lockdown is that we need to keep people apart, right? We're not allowed, we can't have people gathering in too many numbers or too much like concentration, too much density. So how do we resolve that? Okay, then we limit people to be in their houses. So in a way, how do I stop people gathering? By making them gather in another way. That, you know, I mean, I'm limited it to the family unit, but I'm I'm avoiding gathering by gathering. Do you see what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Another form of the same action can be used to give them give results. Or, you know, there's with lockdown or like the idea of social distancing, it's a limitation, of course, but you could say that that produces an effect in people, possibly in terms of bringing more awareness into them. It's like, okay, suddenly now I'm a bit more aware of my body when I go into the shop, in terms of like staying 2 meters away. So, you know, there's more kind of concentration of energy there, you know, like in terms of people experience. The limitation enables kind of like a concentration of energy, you know, which might be useful to us individually, perhaps, or like what we're saying, a higher working maybe needs that energy.
No, I agree with you on that, and I'd like to think this is happening around the world, but definitely in my area, everyone's been much more polite in the big supermarkets. We're all been nodding and smiling at each other, doing our social distancing, not getting too close in the shopping aisles, checking everyone's okay. You know, dog walkers are out and everyone's saying hello to each other, where before we'd probably just perhaps a little nod. I don't know, some dog walkers know each other. You know, I can see how it has made people come a bit more together, and I'd like to think that is everywhere. You know, I haven't heard any bad stories yet, and I hope people are making use of this time of being aware of themselves and other people.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you're saying, it's providing an opportunity, you know, for people for some change. But again, yeah, let's hope people make use of it. Again, in Beelzebub, there's the idea that nature has to, like, what he calls huff and puff, you know, strain herself and try and change all things to adapt to man. Like it's his stupidity. She's trying to work around him and enable him to like perform what is needed, you know, by him, perform his role without too much suffering. It's like she's a mother that's trying to help him do what he needs to do without having to punish him, really. She's trying to limit the work, not use the kind of negative means to, you know, not use the whip. She's trying to encourage him, you know, or use means that involve the least amount of suffering to man. But again, because what we need to do is involves our own choice and participation, she can't force us to do that. So there's limitations in how she can help us from outside, you know. So that's why there's worries that, yeah, if it reaches a certain point, she's only going to be able to use the whip to initiate change, you know.
And obviously we were saying just now about how, you know, sadly people are dying from the virus every day and other things as well, but people are also being born every day.
Yeah.
And I think people forget that.
Yeah, well,
little babies everywhere.
Yeah. Well, again, isn't there's the idea in like, you know, astrology and stuff that the kind of environment, what's going on when you're born, will have some determining influence, obviously, in your, you know, in your person, the kind of type of person that you are. So if the kid's being born in these conditions, who knows? Maybe that will have some effect on their psyche, and maybe this is like, again, part of nature's working to try and change that psyche for the better. I mean, like, isn't there's ideas that kind of, some people have ideas that sort of the 60s, you know, the movement that came about for peace and that in the young people, that came about because they were kind of the generation of the kids of the generation, the kids of the kids who'd been through the Second World War, you know, so that kids had been born into that atmosphere, you know, born to parents who'd been through that atmosphere, and that maybe produced changes in them that enabled, you know, a generation to be a certain way, maybe a bit more awake than normal, and enabled certain changes to be, you know, done through that generation that had lasting benefit to future generations, you know.
Yeah,
But it's funny that that this disease is kind of related to the lungs, you know, that's what it hits. And it's funny that Gurdjieff talks about, and again, another idea of how can we like foster conscience in us, you know, and love towards our fellow man. And he talks about like through remembering their death, you know, we're saying when I look at someone, having some compassion, you know, realizing that they're going to be on their deathbed possibly at one day and maybe shitting themselves about what's going to happen, you know, tapping into that everybody dies, and, you know, who knows how they're going to react to that moment, you know. But the idea that if we can remember that when we look at someone, that will help us. He talks about transform air, you know, like the air being the second food being food. Yeah. So it's like saying, if we're getting into that feeling or remembering that when we look at people, it's like we're kind of more consciously digesting me remembering that when I look at a person can actually enable me to come to be able to love them, or, you know, actually act in that way. So it's funny that this disease is connected with air and breathing, and through the presence of it, we maybe are having some greater compassion towards our fellow man. You know, it's enabling us maybe to feel that we're all in the same boat, and we could all die, you know. So it's just funny that to me that it has a link. It's manifested through something that has a particular effect on the breathing and the breath, you know.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I've been doing this last week. I found it online, and I'm sure other people can. It's on YouTube, a Sekhmet meditation, all about contacting the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. But it's about the lungs and looking at the lungs and visualizing them as trees growing and spreading.
Yeah.
So you know, I recommend that to people, but also you can do it yourselves. Just visualize your lungs being trees and growing and spreading forth, you know, good CO2 and oxygen coming in and going out.
Yeah. And maybe, and also it's weird, isn't it, that because of the lockdown, less people are traveling. So you could say that there's less pollution, so that the air quality for a time has been improved. And in terms of like Beelzebub, that means that is having an influence on people. If the quality of the food, the second food, is different, then maybe this is having, you know, an influence, and particularly on the emotional nature, and you know, maybe can help conscious. Of course, it could just, all the disturbances could just manifest in negative emotions, but there's maybe a potential there for it to stimulate, like, you know, real conscience in us, you know?
Yeah, so we need to send out that vibe of hopefully people will use it in a positive way.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, I would definitely recommend anybody at the moment, I mean, just in terms of a health thing, to, if they do have any interest in any like form of body work, like Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, I don't know, anything like that, I would definitely advise it, obviously, at this time. A, maybe because you've got more time to do it, maybe if you're stuck indoors. And B, particularly because any body work that's related to your lungs, you know, and like your diaphragm, because that, again, that's kind of what the kind of organ that it affects and kills you through is kind of usually through your diaphragm and your breathing. So yeah, I would definitely advise anybody, if they know of any practices that way, or maybe they want to, if they're interested, to look them up, work in terms of work with the body, you know, inhabiting the body, and also with your breath or your lungs, you know.
Yes,
Like
I absolutely second that. And this is like many people are saying over the years, I don't have time to do that. Well, you do now.
Yeah. Well, like they're saying, isn't it? Nobody's, like, there's all those memes going around, isn't there, on the internet, saying, well, if you don't come out of this with some new skill, you know, it's your own fault, or
yeah, you've wasted your time.
yeah. So again, it's always this, you know, two ends of the stick. Every kind of situation has, like, you know, a benefit and a downside, and also then this idea of trying to see what is the third force, you know, trying to rise above just splitting everything into a kind of, you know, dualistic one or the other situation, you know, trying to see what is the third force here, what is, like, you know, when we were saying before about the morality of a higher level, what is real then morality then, you know, if the morality of a higher level or higher intelligence is at odds with my own, then it's like, well, what's real morality then? You know, it's strange to like Gurdjieff talks about the difference between morality that is learned, you know, from all your culture, and conscience. You know, what would be like real morality then? And he says it's kind of objective and doesn't kind of change in the same way that morality does by location. You know, you kind of maybe provide, provided with that that question to ponder. You know, it's strange to think. It's strange to think that what I feel to be, you know, morality or the right could be completely on its head. You know, things that I might see as abhorrent and like the essence of evil might be, you know, the opposite of that. So that's kind of like a hard thing for people really to ponder on the reality of it, because normally our kind of emotional judgments, you know, our emotional attitude, how we see things emotionally, our values, that's kind of where what we most associate with ourselves, you know, our feelings, you know, our moral outlook, you know, that's kind of what we most identify ourselves with as a person, or say differentiates people. Is not so much what ideas you have, but what values do you subscribe to emotionally, what makes you feel, what makes you laugh, what makes you cry. We kind of see that as much more determining on who you are, or, you know, your individuality. So we tend to associate ourselves more with our emotions. So it could be hard for us to disassociate ourselves with our emotion, or conceive or accept of some, you know, more real working of reality that appears to be the opposite of our moral conceptions. We might find that hard to bear, isn't it? So the idea being that maybe, you know, a Christian's lived all his life, you know, believing God to be a certain way, and then maybe like he gets to heaven and God's a twat. Sorry to use that language, but it's like someone he doesn't like, and he thinks you're a bad God or whatever. Do you know what I mean? You'd be like,
Sorry,
oh,
I'm
what the
laughing.
hell?
Right, yeah.
Well, that would be like your worst nightmare, isn't it? If you're a little Christian and you've spent your whole life, like, you know, believing God to be a certain way. I'm using a crude example here, and then you meet him and you hate him. What are you going to do? You're stuck. He's God, and you're stuck in a creation that morally is repellent to you. You can imagine that being like a person's hell, a nightmare, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, I know some beliefs say that your heaven is going to be what you think it is. So if people are sitting there thinking it's going to be, you know, God's going to be a twat, and when I meet him, I'm going to have a good old word with him. They're going to get that kind of heaven. Or, you know, if you're sitting there thinking, God's going to be loving Jesus with his arms outstretched to embrace me, he'll be there for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the idea then, that our own thinking is going to determine our reality. Mm-hmm. And it's like you could say that in either one of those situations, though we might say the person who has the more positive outlook might be in a better position than the one who has the negative. You could see that if whatever heaven they go to is just dependent on their own thinking, then you could say that that's like, you know, a limitation, you know, because you're gonna whatever thinking you can handle or come up with is going to determine what reality you can bear or access. So though we might think, oh, well, the one who has a positive outlook's better off than the other, in terms of maybe like if there is a higher truth, then they're both equally screened from that. And, you know, they're only seeing the projections of their own mind, or how they can conceive truth. You know, there's like that idea in kind of Buddhism, okay, it came through that. And I think it's kind of been misunderstood through the generations, like the idea of multiple reincarnations, and like samsara, you know, being this stuck in the kind of a cycle of repetition, and like needing to escape from that, and that being like, you know, nirvana. There was an idea that when you died, you went to the afterlife, and what that kind of consisted of was you being subject to the content of your mind. So, you know, like when we go to sleep and dream, you could say normally we don't have any control over that, so we're just subject to random association, the mind just creating situations, imagining things going this way or the other. So there's the idea
that I'm going to let my dog in, he's going to start barking, but carry on, sorry.
Yeah. So there's the kind of idea that in this like afterlife, you know, that you're going to be subject to kind of random combinations of your own mind, creations of your own mind. And of course, there's ideas then about going through the bardos and the different worlds, and all these worlds again kind of being reflections of what's already inside you. So like being limited, like stuck in samsara, then it would be like being stuck in the afterlife, but just being subject to dreams, creation in you of dreams, and not knowing that what's happened to you. Like they talk about souls, not some souls not knowing that they're dead. And you could see why, because they're kind of still experiencing a dream world, creations of their mind that are like dreams. So they still think they're still experienced in their mind like a physical world and going about their normal business and creating scenarios, that seem realistic to them. So somebody in that situation is just in there. You'd just be stuck in whatever dreams you happen to create or arise in you. And they could be pleasant dreams, like, meeting Christ, or they could be nasty dreams. So the idea
nightmares.
is that, so that was the idea, that there was a need to get out of being subject to like the creations of your own mind, or being able to have more of a more intentional use on that, rather than it just being an automatic, random association. That maybe you could become aware of that, the content of your mind then, and direct it.
Well, this is one of the things that I like about the Gurdjieff work, actually, is it is to prepare you for your death, isn't it? Like we were saying back earlier in the show about how everyone dies, and being aware of that helps you with yourself as well. But it also helps you prepare for your own death. He says we don't want to die like a dog, but by studying his work and other books on this kind of thing, you do become aware of your mortality, and that many people are very scared of dying, aren't they? And this is what we want to make people aware of, not to be scared of it, it's a cycle. It's part of a cycle.
I think there's that idea of
sorry, my dog's barking again.
It's all right. Come on. It's the buried dog's barking to get our attention, eh?
Yes. It's going to want to go out in a minute. So. But yes, carry on about death.
Well, I mean, there's that idea that like the remembrance of death then is to serve as like to show us the reality, or the possible reality and value to our choices. Like you could say, well, what's the point of remembering that I'm going to die? Well, the idea being that if I remember that can have some influence on my actions, and this part of it being that it can make me, see, or at least feel, or try to feel the reality of choice, and appreciating that I have at least I have the illusion then of choice. So I still have to act responsibly, even if that's an illusion, because I seem to have choice. So I have to try to develop some responsibility towards that power of choice. So then trying to be conscious in my decisions in terms of making them, really making them, say, okay, I'm going to make this decision, from the whole of myself, appreciating that I am making a choice that will have actual consequences here, for better or for worse. And if I make this choice, I want to make it in such a way that I am able to bear those consequences, whatever they are. I don't want to be making a choice and then just being complaining about the consequences of it, because I'm not taking responsibility for the fact that I've made that choice then. Do you know what I mean? It's if you make your choices in such a way that you really can entertain the different possible consequences, then it's and can experience what it would be like for those consequences to happen in yourself. Then if negative consequences happen, you're no longer attached to them because you've already gone through it. So again, here, you could see ideas about die before you die. If you're able to make a choice kind of fully consciously, then not only is there a freedom in that moment of the decision, but you could see there's a freedom then in terms of how you will be related to any results. You won't be identified with them if you can make a real choice. You'll be able to bear the consequences of your decision, for better or worse.
Well, I know we were just talking about death, but also with Gurdjieff's work, it's very much about learning how to live in this life. And, it's something we all want to do. We want to live a full, harmonious, for a better word. We want to live properly.
Yeah, well, you want to feel fulfilled, So again, his idea that we have these three, just say three main natures, then your mind, your feelings, and your body, and that they each have different needs, they have their own particular education that they need, their own kind of food, and their own wants and desires. And that if we can't satisfy them, then we're going to be experiencing some dissatisfaction. And again, that dissatisfaction could manifest in different ways. Two ends of the stick. It could, we could go make us behave negatively or be in suffering, or maybe that dissatisfaction causes us to, inquire into it. But again, if we can't fulfill the needs that we have, the different parts of us have, then yeah, we're gonna feel unfulfilled and kind of be in suffering. Again, part of his work is the idea of trying to remove as much as possible the unnecessary suffering. Again, he kind of says that you're not going to remove all the suffering in your life because there's a value to it. There's a need in the relation of suffering to, like, learning and understanding and transformation. But of course, he says the 90% of our suffering is like imaginary suffering or unnecessary that could be changed. If we could live a life that was really fulfilling to our inner needs. Like he talks about that in terms of the emotions a lot, like the horse. In the analogy of man as a horse, cart, and driver, the cabbie. The horse is like your emotions. And he says that's, because of the conditions around it, the education, the life it's been brought into, it's just kind of like whipped and beaten, for all its life. So it just withdraws into itself. It doesn't want to come out because it's so used to feeling kind of scolded. Like the kid goes to school and, like, basically, like, you could see in a sense that all our education comes down to is learning the word no as kids. It's just no. Just a different series of that. No, that's not right. This is right. No, that's not right. So it's just like learning no. So that's like all our relationship to our emotions comes down to, like, the driver with his reins who can control the horse possibly or direct it. He has no real understanding of the horse or communication with it. So, like, the child, all he learns is how to say no, in effect, to his emotions or natural impulses, and act in a different way, the way that he's been taught how to act.
Because education should be really about teaching children how to experience life. Obviously learn your history and your maths and your English, and learn to read and write, or whatever language you speak, but also to be a part of something, to be a part of a team, which is the human race.
Yeah. Like the idea that you through education, you'd learn not just like what you need in order to function and get by in the world, like maths and English, whatever is the basic minimum requirement of knowledge. Yeah, you'd learn that. But then the idea being that ideally through the education, you would kind of come to know your particular, nature. So that if I know kind of what my particular nature is in contrast to others, like say what type I am, then if you like just, some self-knowledge, then I have a kind of a means to order my life, or at least a means to try to make my life correspond to what I really need, So that education at a certain point has to move beyond objective in the sense of us all learning the same stuff, and has to move to the subjective in terms of what I particularly need for my own particular individuality. And also the idea being that it can, instead of it just like closing us off inside ourselves and distancing ourselves from ourselves, just not like Gurdjieff says, all we learn is like a policeman. All our education consists of is this development of this inner policeman who says what we're allowed to do or what we're not allowed to do based on, what we've been taught. So there's no scope for like freedom, but just no scope to really act in a way that's
to be the real you.
Yeah. So like the idea that the confidence isn't, I can't say taught because you don't really taught confidence, but it isn't kind of instilled in us through our education, the confidence that we can, learn and develop, or that we're going to be able to meet the, situations. Because like there is the idea that most people really live their life in fear. Like if they're walking down the street, whether it's overtly or subconsciously, they're just kind of worried about who's this other person who's walking past me in the street. Obviously, that's more obvious if you live in downtown Compton in New York, where there's that's fair enough. But most of us don't live in
fears, isn't there? There's also the people live in fear of, can I pay the bills? Will I have enough rent? Fear of, what does my boss think of my work? Or fear of, am I doing the right thing for my partner? Or everything. It's fearful, and it shouldn't be. We should be enjoying life and living together.
Yeah, just the idea that hopefully that through our education you develop, I think like psychologically now they call it resilience. So just some kind of at least minimum level of a kind of an inner peace or stability that's not so perturbed by those, like, you know, say you've got like a week to find some rent money or you might be kicked out. Of course, yes, it's fair enough to be a bit worried. That's just it. But is that worry going to cripple me in terms of being able to, for my intelligence to be able to operate, to like maybe find a way? Or, you know, is that fear just going to make me maybe have an extreme mental breakdown or do something crazy as a reaction to that possible fear? You know, yeah, can I develop some, call it resilience then, in how I can meet those hazardous situations? Like in the Bible, isn't there, they're asking him for like assurances for tomorrow. You know, the disciples and the people, they want to know that like, say if they follow God, then that tomorrow and the next day and the next day is always going to be like, you know, safe, and they're not going to go through any problems. And he kind of like, you know, talks about the birds and they're not having a care for tomorrow, and that, you know, they believe that they're kind of going to be taken care of. So some sort of faith, hope, love, I don't know what you want to call it, some impulse that's not so conditional, you know, on the circumstances, and it was not so tied to what physical situations are going on or might happen or might not. You know, some belief in something more than just the situations, or that we're going to be just the product, you know, of what happens to us. You know, so we're like the victim. You know, just a victim mode, that we have a fear of what's going to happen to us, and that's going to kind of determine who we are, or, you know.
Yes, well, I would say back in the when I was growing up as a teenager in the 80s, one of our big things that we always used to say to each other was no fear.
Yeah.
No fear of anything. And Star Wars is all about that. If you don't want to go and read Gurdjieff, go and watch the Star Wars movies. I haven't seen the last one, so I don't know about that. But the first three are all about don't use fear. Fear takes you to the dark side.
Yeah. Have you seen Dune, the science film Dune?
I've seen the film. I know there's a new series being made.
No, I just meant the original film.
Yeah.
Well, because it comes from a book, and I think
Yeah,
there's
I've read
like
the book, James Herbert,
yeah.
I think.
Well, there's a thing about fear there, isn't he? Like, it's something about, like, you know, him saying fear is the mind killer, so like the intelligence killer, you know, and all of it. So I need to kind of consciously experience fear, like go through it, kind of see where it comes from, and if I can harness that, go through my fears, then I'll harness the energy of fear, then that can like really sharpen your mind, isn't it? Like there's that saying, there's nothing that focuses the mind so much as the, you know, if you're waiting to be hanged. If you're like sitting in the prison, you've got 10 minutes before you're going to be hanged, your mind could probably be quite, you know, receptive.
Alert.
Yeah, you might be very much taken in, but again, we can have that influx of energy, maybe be much more aware than we would normally be through the because of deaths, the presence of death, we may be more aware. But again, maybe in a given person that just blows his mind, it's too much, you know, so that maybe he wouldn't be able to get something out of those last few moments, that if we could kind of handle it, there may be something that could really be learned in those few moments before, you know, death. You know, I mean, like, there's that idea, isn't there, that like it's never too late for redemption or salvation, and like death, the criminal on the cross, you know, that there's always the potential there for such a large degree or quality of consciousness to come about, that you could learn everything that somebody else could learn for the whole course of their life in like a moment, if there was enough, you know, energy there, if you like, you know.
That's what I like about this kind of thing then, because it's always available, as it should be, for anyone at any time. And that's why, you know, I'm not saying people should have no excuses, but there is no excuse. But you've got to want to do it at the same. You've got to want to find things. You want to open yourself up, or you want to develop, or you want to move on, or you want to just stay the same as you are, one of the herd mentality, or an automaton, as Gurdjieff would call it. And if you're happy with that, maybe it'd be on the next round that you will start to look into these things.
Yeah, well, like there's that idea, isn't there, that, you know, that say in the work then, or in, you know, Beelzebub's Tales, that everything serves, you know, everything has a role, plays a role, whether it wants to or not, you know. So the mechanical man is just as equally as much needed and necessary as the conscious man. You know, like he kind of says that, talks about it in terms of like biology and cells. Like he says, well, some cells are evolving and other cells are involving there needs to be a certain amount of involutionary cells in order for the conscious cells to like feed on. You know, he always talks about it like that, or just that they perform different functions. You know, the mechanical man serves the kind of, you know, the more general cosmic processes, you know, keeps things ticking over. But then they're saying the real man can serve a different function, but they're both needed. So maybe or suggest that maybe there's never going to be some situation where everybody's kind of on the same level. There's always going to be differences of level, because it's that difference of level that enables like transformation, you know. Like he talks about, say, the idea, oh, there's never going to be one religion in the world that everybody adheres to. And so that kind of implies that there's always going to be some level of difference that can lead to conflict, you know. Because there's never going to be one belief that we all subscribe to, there's always going to be some friction between people. So then it comes down to how can we manage that, you know, friction.
Well, I've always thought on that one, it's because they're trying to teach us that even though there's one truth, people have different ideas about it. We should still be able to live together and appreciate that other people have other views, but people aren't listening.
Yeah, well, it's like you say, we're so identified with our identity is so linked to our thoughts, our viewpoint, that it's like if someone expresses a different viewpoint to mine, it's like that's like I take that as like an assault on my individuality. You know, so if someone ridicules my belief, then again, like that's felt as a direct like ridicule of me, my, you know, individuality. So we like have this emotional and attachment to our beliefs and values, you know, and so that attachment is what it's like the stick of dynamite that can be you know, if it's offended in a certain way, that can be explosive, you know, because we're attached to our beliefs. Whereas if we could hold the beliefs without the same kind of attachment to them, that like not identify ourselves with our whatever our beliefs were, then maybe we could interact in a way that doesn't have to lead to all the negative stuff, because we're able to handle the fact that different people can have different see things differently, you know. Normally I can't handle that, because it kind of, in my dualistic way of thinking, that means, well, if someone has a difference of opinion, one of us is right and one of us is wrong, and I don't want to be the one who's who's wrong, because of, again, my attachment to being right and all these ideas that have, you know, that have been taught me.
Well, Josh, it's been fabulous talking to you. I'm going to bring it to a close because my dog is staring at me, and he's just come up an hour early. We don't normally go out till 7:30, but he obviously wants to go out now. His clock must be wrong. So,
he's entitled to his walk, so I don't want to interfere with that. And other functions need to be taken care of, probably. So I don't want to get in the way of that.
I'm just concerned he's going to start barking. I keep hearing him going. Rrr. But it's been fabulous talking to you. You're still doing your blog, and you're still doing the Facebook page, Bezel Hubs Tales.
Yeah,
that people can go to
the
work.
The blog page like is on WordPress, and that's just called The Tapestry of Beelzebub's Tales. If you write The Tapestry of Beelzebub's Tales, it probably will come up. So that's just a blog, you know. But I would also like to plug that, as you know, there's the All and Everything conference, you know, the Gurdjieff International Conference that happens every year, and it's happening this year, but it's happening online this year, you know, because of COVID. So if anybody's watching this and they're watching this prior to like the 14th, 15th of May, there's time to register for it if they want to be part of it and look at and watch the different talks and presentations that people are giving. And obviously it's a plug for myself because I'm giving one of the presentations. So
yeah, and also Tony Blake is, and I have discussions with him on YouTube, and many other brilliant speakers. And that's at the All and Everything conference.org. I can't remember.
Yeah, I think
the International Humanities Conference.
It is, but if you type in All and Everything Conference, or even just A and E Conference, I think that does get you there. It should
come up. Yes, yeah. I recommend people to go. I attend them. They're fabulous. It's a conference of the books, so many people think it's going to be like a workshop, but it's not. It's normally discussing the writings of G I Gurdjieff.
Yeah. So hopefully, maybe if people, you know, some people watching this will maybe don't even know, haven't heard about it, and they'll get to attend it. Yeah,
it's another great way of coming into learning about the Gurdjieff work.
Well, yeah, and like just an opportunity to talk about people who are into it. Yeah, that was really interesting for me when I attended one the other year where you were there. That, apart from obviously the great talks and that, and the insights that people have had, that's great. But just getting to interact with other people who have the same you know, I found it curious to look around like, okay, so these are my people then. Do you know what I mean? This is my tribe, you know.
That's what I like about it. And that's why I'm hoping that next year everything will be back to normal and we'll be back to going to wherever it's going to be held next year, because it's not just the talks that are important, it's also that, like you say, the social interacting, because then people can talk freely, and like you say, you're with your tribe, so you don't feel like you're saying anything stupid, because people know we don't say anything stupid and everything's open to interpretation.
So it's just, it's like you say, it's nice to feel, you know, some greater sense of you know, community or sameness, you know, between yourself and others, and to, you know, lots of others, and to feel like you're in a, you know, an environment that's your environment, you know, that this is your passion, you know. That's great.
And it's called The All and Everything because Gurdjieff, I know many people don't realise this, but Beelzebub's Tales is just part one of a series of books he did. And he calls the whole lot of his books All and Everything. And Beelzebub's Tales is part of that. In fact, the title for Beelzebub's Tales is All and Everything, an objectively impartial criticism of the life of man, or Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson.
So like, it's a lot. All and Everything is the series of the books, isn't it? It's all of his books, isn't it, really? The three main, you know. So All and Everything, a good title. You know, the idea that he's going to, like he says, oh, I'm not going to do what normal authors do. I'm not going to take the petty size of a country or even the planet for my study. I'm taking the whole universe. But I think there's the idea that everything is his idea that everything is connected, everything is relevant. So it's like, if you can understand how to make an omelette, which he says, like the Beelzebub's Tales, the book contains everything, even how to make an omelette, even though there isn't no explicit description of how to make an omelette. So he's kind of said, if you can learn one thing, really, you can learn anything. Or if you can kind of really see the principles that are present in one thing, those same principles are present in everything, you know. So like the Philosopher's Stone, you know, the Philosopher's Stone can only work because reality is such that it's interconnected, that everything has some similarities built on the same kind of essential structure or pattern. So hopefully, if you get one thing out of it, that'll be like a thread, and you can get the whole thing out of that.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. And
we'll do it's a pleasure.
Soon.
Pleasure to talk to you, Debbie, as always. It's good crack.
Marvellous. Thank you very much. I shall press the stop button.
Thank you, Debbie. See you later.